story gets worse before it got better, but we're both healthy today. It took a long time for me not to tear up when I thought about her birth and how jarring it was for our new family. It was also a lesson in remembering how much I won't be able to control as a parent. See. After several hours, the nurse put monitors on and could not find our child's heart. Our hearts dropped, and what happened after that happened so fast. I tried several positions, and finally they found her heart, but it dropped so much the doctor called in everyone. Next thing I know, I'm being wheeled out to the surgery room for an emergency C-section. My husband couldn't be with me. I was crying so much because not only would my husband not get to be with me, I was also under general anesthesia. I've never had major surgery, and here I was about to be put under and not get to witness my daughter's birth. It was scary. I woke up and was in the NICU because she had fluid, and my daughter was in the NICU because she had fluid in her lungs. I thank God every day our little girl is alive and healthy. She's 4 months, and to this day, I still have moments of fear, sadness, depression because of the entire experience. I don't want another, and that makes me sad too. Jay. I feel like I was robbed of an experience I'll never be able to have again. I came into my second child's birth so open. I had no birth plan except to get an epidural, and I literally didn't even get that. It was the worst day of my life. How can I even say that about my daughter's birth? Everyone says it will take time to heal. I'm trying to believe them as well. I'm Alexis, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the founder of Not Safe for Mom Group, which is a community that exists online and in real life, where we talk about the things that other spaces don't always welcome and that are really hard to talk about, and that I feel sometimes mothers aren't invited to talk about because people don't want to hear us say them. And I think that the subject of birth is one of the hardest things that I've ever had to moderate as a facilitator. And in the online conversations, I invited people to share their birth stories, and I posted them anonymously on everyone's behalf. And I'm sure I have some of your words on my page and maybe in here. But the experience of being a moderator for people's birth stories was so extremely overwhelming that it caused me, I had to take a break. People were sending me these stories that I could tell people had not processed them and maybe had just put them in a dark place and never revisited them, and that even writing them to me was probably re-traumatizing in a lot of ways. And it also brought up a lot of things about my own birth that I had not visited in a very long time. And that was an 8 years ago event that I thought I had made peace with, I'd written articles about, and it was just a very eye-opening experience. So what I realized was, with a lot of my topics that I moderate online, I kind of just say, okay, that was really great, guys. Moving on to the next topic, because there's so many things women want to talk about. But with this, I felt like we needed something much more. We needed to take a deeper look at it, and we needed some more action. And instead of just holding space for a topic, I wanted to bring in some experts that could help us contextualize the process of birth, understand some of our stories, and have some takeaways of how we can better process what's happened to us. And so what I decided to do was I was going to aggregate a lot of your stories and use that as a framework to have this conversation. So I found Sara, Lyon. We've been friends for a while, but she was one of the first people I started having conversations about birth and trauma with, and whenever she spoke, I just found myself being like, hold on, wait. And I started writing everything down. And I really love her approach because it's a measured approach. She knows that, I revere the medical profession, but she has such an insight and a respect for medicine and for like an Eastern approach, and one of the smartest women I've ever heard speak about birth. And I was like, I needed to share her knowledge with you guys to give a background on who she is. She's a doula, childbirth educator, prenatal massage therapist, and mother of 2. And she founded Glow Birth and Body and the Birth Deck by Glow. And GLOW's mission is to educate and empower all birthing couples, no matter where they're birthing or what kind of birth they're having. And she'll go into her perspective on her own. I'm not going to speak for her, but one of the things that I really liked learning from her was about the very specific context in which birth occurs, and that it's not in a vacuum, and that there are all these layers like within our country and our city and then our ethnicity and our race that all impact what kind of birth we end up experiencing, and I never thought of it that way, and we're going to go into that deeper tonight. And Sara helped connect me with Dr. Ingrid Nkongho, who's over here, and she's a clinical psychologist with a background in treating a broad range of problems, including life transitions, anxiety, depression, mood disorders, and complex trauma. We thought it was really important that whoever we brought in had experience with trauma, because I feel like that's really different than just anxiety and mood, and because trauma, as you will explain, has its own symptoms and is a different category, and so we will explain some of the different terms that we're talking about tonight. So I'm really excited that you're here to join us. Ingrid maintains a private practice in New York City and is part of the clinical team at the Seleni Institute, where she provides support for new and expectant mothers and holds a new mothers group. So I thought that the three of us together would be a nice perspective, with me as like the question asker, the person who's gathered all of your stories and can represent the I have no idea what happened to me, can we help make sense of it? And then we have, you know, a perinatal mental health expert who works for one of the most prestigious organizations for postpartum mood disorders and speaks with moms every single day about their experiences, and then a birth educator and doula who supported thousands of families through their transitions through to parenthood. And we were going to have one more speaker. I advertised her for weeks, but she had a family emergency. It was Erica M. McAfee, and she helps people through their transition of grief and when they have stillborns and miscarriage. And I thought that loss is also a really important part of this conversation too, because we bring loss to our birth when we've experienced that, whether it's our infertility journey or losses that we've carried in many different ways. But I think that there's opportunity to talk about that tonight without her here. But I do want to bring her to you guys at another point in the future. What we are not going to do tonight is share our personal birth stories, because I feel like that could be a whole separate retreat that we should devote like a week to, because each person's story is so unique, and I feel like we would need like a dedicated therapist for each one of us. And I think it could possibly be triggering to the person telling the story, or to re-traumatizing to those around us. So I made that decision that tonight is about information and a conversation with these people, and hopefully some of the questions that you already brought up on Not Safe for Mom group online will help, will fulfill some of the things that you wanted to talk about tonight, and then at the end we'll open it to questions. But I didn't want to do like a circle sharing of birth stories, because I just didn't think it would be as productive in tonight's event. We're gonna I'm videotaping this, but it's not live. The video is just on us, so anything that happens with the group will not be recorded. But if you're uncomfortable with the idea of like your voice being recorded or being photographed, please just let me know. I'll make sure that that doesn't make it anywhere online on my website or on Facebook. I want to thank The Wild for hosting this conversation and having us here. I love this space for its energy, and it just feels really nice to be here. So it's a really great place, and I love the front with all of the great books and things that you can buy. And in lieu of a fee for the event tonight, I'm collecting donations for the Birth Justice Fund, which works to eliminate disparities in pregnancy and birth outcomes experienced by women of color, low-income women, young women and transgender people. So you can Venmo me and just write event or Birth Justice Fund or that thing you talked about during the event tonight, and I will know where it goes. But we have a couple of papers up there that tell you where my Venmo can be found. And that's, I hope that I can encourage you to consider donating tonight. And then if you haven't already, at some point tonight, follow The Wild and Glow Birth and Body and Not Safe for Mom Group, and they're all one of those things too. Okay. Sorry, I talked a lot. I'm gonna open this up to other people. So Dr. Nkongho, I look to you to help define some of the terms, because I just threw out a whole bunch, like perinatal mood disorders and trauma, and I think that this is a rich landscape, and I'd love if you could just couch us, ground us in some of the terms that we're talking about.
Sure. Good evening, everyone, and please call me Ingrid.
Sorry, I've been writing it on my outline for
yes.
2 weeks, so.
No worries. It is overwhelming, and there's so many different terms to describe an experience. But just to sort of orient us to some of the terminology, there are so many different disorders that describe symptoms, basically, that you might experience after having a traumatic experience, a traumatic birth experience. So you may be familiar with PMADS, which stands for perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, and that's sort of an umbrella term that represents a constellation of different disorders, and it includes postpartum depression, which you may be familiar with. That sort of gets most of the attention. It also includes anxiety. So anxiety has a few different presentations. It might be a generalized anxiety where you're just feeling really worried all the time about a lot of different things. Nothing specific, but you worry about getting your work done. You worry about the baby. You just worry about a lot of different things. Another that falls under the anxiety umbrella is obsessive compulsive disorder, and that manifests if you have lots of ruminations, like thoughts that just keep coming up, like you can't stop replaying or thinking about something, or compulsions where you can't stop engaging in a behavior. Often it's a behavior that you think will make something right or undo something. So for example, if you find that you're checking the baby monitor constantly, because if you don't, if that one time you don't, might be the time that your baby doesn't wake up. Another anxiety disorder that falls under this umbrella would be panic attacks. So that's a physical manifestation of anxiety. If you notice that out of nowhere you suddenly feel dizzy, or you feel like your heart's racing, or short of breath, or that you break out easily into a sweat. That would be some examples of a physical manifestation of anxiety. And sometimes you'll notice a trend, like, oh, this happens every time I, walk past another mom with a baby. Or it may be out of the blue. You're just, at home and you're watching a show or something, and then suddenly you're hijacked by some physical sensation. You can't quite put your finger on it. And then the last one that is more relevant to our discussion would be related to trauma. And so you've probably all heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And that has its own set of symptoms that are very specific. It involves having experienced a traumatic event where either you were threatened with death, or you witnessed someone who was threatened with death, or with a sexual assault, an act of sexual violence against you. So the definition to meet PTSD is very, very specific in that way, and it has a lot of symptoms to actually meet the disorder. Some of those symptoms include if you have intrusions. So intrusions might be thoughts where you're replaying your traumatic experience over and over. Like you can't stop thinking about it. You might be hijacked by a memory of something that happened. You might have dreams that have the theme of the traumatic event. On the other side, you might also have a tendency to avoid reminders of the event. So it may be hard to talk about. You may find that when someone is talking about your birth experience or wants to ask you about it, you avoid it. Or if you see something on TV or you're reminded of it, your natural instinct is not to go there. Other symptoms would be a really strong reactivity, so like startling very easily. Again, that might come out of nowhere. You might not understand like why you're so, on edge. Other characteristics would be changes in your mood, so and of your self-image. So if you're noticing suddenly, my outlook about the world is that it's just hopeless. The world, others around me, what's the point? Or you notice that you're extremely irritable. Some other symptoms related to PTSD are dissociation, and that's where you might have a sense of unreality. Like it might seem like things around you are not quite real, or you might feel in your body like you don't feel like yourself. You might even have experiences where you feel like you're observing yourself, like you're outside of your body. So as you can see, PTSD is very layered, and there are many, many different symptoms to meet that specific disorder. But it's really important to know that a lot of women that go through a post-traumatic birth experience, they might meet some of those symptoms, and it does not take away from the fact that they still had a traumatic experience. So I don't want the diagnoses and the names of the disorders to sort of invalidate what you might be experiencing. You might be experiencing sadness. You might be experiencing anxiety and feeling on edge. You might be having some of the symptoms of a panic attack. You might be having some of the symptoms of PTSD, but you may not be meeting the full criteria. And honestly, it doesn't mean that your experience is not valid. It doesn't mean that it's not disruptive. And it doesn't mean that you don't warrant or deserve having help. So I just want, even though there's so many details about these disorders, I just want to really emphasize that point, because I don't want to minimize the significance of the experience itself. Because if it's distressing to you, if it's interrupting or causing disruptions in how you feel, in your relationships, in your functioning, then it's valid and it's definitely important to get help.
And I just want to jump in and say that my experience working with women after birth, even years after birth, so not in immediate postpartum necessarily at all, is that most of us actually we've been educated to really look primarily at the life or death element of birth in our common culture. And so what that means is that we actually are perceiving the threat of death in birth, and it's both someone else's that we're witnessing and potentially of our own. So that element of trauma, even for people who've had actually really seamless births, is oftentimes still there.
Agreed. And when you're talking about trauma, a definition of it is any experience where you feel like your capacities are not meeting the situation. You're overwhelmed by the situation is considered a traumatic experience. So again, the definitions are there and they serve a function in the clinical and medical community, but it's very important to acknowledge what your experience is. And if your experience was that of being overwhelmed, flooded, and feeling helpless, that counts as a trauma.
Yeah. I didn't realize with my own birth that it was traumatic to me until years later. And I had an emergency C-section, and there was this moment in the operating room where my husband left, much like one of the stories here, and the baby left, and nobody was there to hold my hand. And I could feel everything, and I was like, can someone just hold my hand? I'm in so much pain. I just need somebody, anybody in this room, any stranger, just please hold my hand. And there was nobody to hold my hand. And it was just such a feeling of being lost and left alone. And that's one of my greatest fears, is being left alone. And it took me probably 8 years to realize that was a trauma. It wasn't through this work that I do that I realized that that was a trauma. But then I had to ask myself, and I do want to ask both of you, like, to go all this time thinking that you had just an experience and you trusted your doctors, and I still do. I trust the choice that she made. Is it empowering, or is it useful to know that you endured a trauma? Or is it, I don't know, did you not need to know that? Did it not help?
Did you want to respond? Or?
I mean, I have thoughts, but I'd love to hear. You want me to go first? Okay. I would say yes. I think it's very important because it is actually informing our behavior on a consistent basis that we might not really be aware of. It also might only occasionally be informing and influencing our behavior, but nevertheless, that's something we should be aware of, because realistically, it's going to be influencing us in some of those more important and stressful times. And those are the times where we oftentimes need our faculties about us in the most balanced way. And it can be impacting all sorts of relationships that we don't even connect to that birth experience. Like you said, like, it's your greatest fear. It maybe was your greatest fear before. It certainly is now. How much of an impact did that have? And without identifying that, it's really hard to do the work.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, because what happens when you have a traumatic experience, you are in survival mode in that time. So you know, I'm sure you've heard of the fight, flight, freeze. You're using whatever tools you have available to you at that time. And what often happens is that the experience becomes fragmented after that. And so you might revisit bits and parts of it, but piecing it together in a cohesive narrative that you can make sense of is very important to healing. And so I think being able to identify it is the first step towards that, so that it doesn't feel fragmented and out of control, which was how the experience was when it was happening. So that's, one of the goals, I would say, in therapy and working on processing trauma.
And it's interesting as a birth educator to think about what you just said, because one of the most paralyzing and sort of fraught hormones that can enter the picture, one of the most detrimental hormones for physiologic birth, so for vaginal birth, is adrenaline. And so if you enter labor already in fight or flight because of a past birth, because of hearing stories about birth, because of a common cultural understanding that birth is dangerous, you're already feeling overwhelmed and fragmented before anything has even happened yet. So it's interesting that it's actually this full loop on that same survival mode.
So your previous birth having been traumatic, can you enter that second birth with these hormones?
There is no doubt about that. But and then I also observe, and it's well documented, that we, because of the way that we're educated or not educated about childbirth, and because we don't birth in community anymore in the communities that we're growing up in, most of us, certainly in America, we don't witness birth in all of its manifestations. So we're not comfortable with the sights and the smells and the sounds. We're not comfortable with watching somebody go through such an intense event, physically, mentally, like even on like a psycho-spiritual level, right? So when we go through it, it is only an aberration from the norm. There is no prior context, so you're actually entering it already with just movies. And I always say to my clients, like, you have to remember that you've heard stories about birth, even though you feel like you've never heard birth stories until now. You know, you feel like you're blindsided by this phase of your life, but you heard your mom talking to your auntie and your cousin about this thing and that happened, and you didn't even realize you're like a little sponge. So you're already fragmented before you even have a chance to be whole in the experience. So it's important to know when it happens so that maybe you can go back and do what we're doing tonight, which is actually put the pieces back together and re-educate ourselves so that we have a better understanding.
Can you talk more about the birthing and community and what that looked like and compared to today? And
so in a lot of places in the world today, people, and still in hospitals, in birth centers and homes all over America, but they're rare. There are people who are gathering, and there are large groups actually at birth. So I worked in San Diego as a doula when I was a new doula, and we have a lot, the hospital that I worked in was right on the border of Tijuana, and so there are a lot of families there who are indigenous Mexican families, right? So they're like native Mexicans, and they, in their now home country in Mexico, or in their prior home country, they didn't have access necessarily to medical care that was at the ready because they lived out in the countryside and in the mountains. So they all had local midwives who worked with them, and they would all come together for birth, and so they would support each other. And coming to America didn't change that. They would all be in the hospital rooms together, and would sometimes bring like full-on catering, and there would be people of all different ages. And you think about a 7-year-old out of birth, and it's like her fourth birth that year, and it's February. She's thinking about birth really differently, and when she is in that process and she's feeling those feelings and hearing herself, like for those of us who have given birth, like you hear the sound of yourself in that birth, that in itself, that tone and that pitch is in itself such a different sound than you experience on your normal day. But if you've associated that with a whole arc of birth, that sound isn't scary, right? So without those fully informative events in our lives, we enter birth, and every single piece of it is new. It's associated with movies, it's associated with risk statistics, and we don't see the full arc of someone coming through it.
It's like we need to be like flooded with like birth stories our entire lives, and
Yes.
it would have been a better alternative to the first real experience of birth being our own.
Yes, and interestingly, and then I'll stop because I could probably talk about this forever. But on
Tell me more.
I know. So Instagram has had this really cool movement that was started by a woman named Katie Vigos, who is a badass. And she's a nurse, she's a healthcare worker. She has 3 kids of her own. She has done some like sort of like doula work, but never like as a full profession. And after she had a traumatic C-section, and then I think she had 2 VBACs, so 2 vaginal births after cesarean, she decided that she was going to change the way that people are learning, being informed about birth. And the way she was going to do that was through Instagram, to petition Instagram to uncensor childbirth. So people on the subway around me are really catching an eyeful because like 90% of my accounts are birth accounts, and my husband is like, you are crazy, like this is amazing, and also you have to put that away right now. It's just like crowning babies. But the whole vision is that if you see birth and you see what's possible, and you also hear the sounds, and you see the body do its thing, when you're going through birth yourself, you first of all know it's possible, you second of all know it's normal, and you know you have some vision of why and how. So that's sort of like the modern community. It's all on Instagram. It's real life, guys.
How do you know if you had a birth or if you had a like fucked up birth? Like, how do you know if you just like whether your birth was messed up,
Right.
or if that's just the way birth is?
So, and Ingrid, I would love to know what you think about this. We sort of talked about this the other night, and I would love to hear your feedback on it. I personally feel, having given birth twice myself, that whether you're having a cesarean birth, which I would highly recommend everyone sort of start talking about their C-sections as a cesarean birth, or you had a vaginal birth, that either way, even if you have a seamless, vaginal birth or a planned C-section and you get there on time and all the things are happening, there's an element, even if it's just a grain of trauma in each one of those events, because you, first of all, are going to be, essentially, the vast majority of us will be sacrificing of our flesh either way, right? And you certainly are going to be putting yourself, you will be put through a process, your body will put you through a process where you will have to fully face the fact that only you can get this baby out of your body. So even with a cesarean birth, you are putting yourself there and you're doing this for the sake of this baby and of this birth, right? That is the same as a woman right at the moment of crowning. Just as you're about to crown, you suddenly hit this moment where you're like, oh, the only way out is through me. And to stop and fully understand that in that moment of intensity is that in itself, and then pushing through that is a little bit traumatizing. And then there's a beauty that comes where I can go deep on the more like metaphysical component, but I don't know, how hippy dippy we want to go here, but there is an element of putting your sort of head into the jaws of the beast and then just trusting it's not going to bite down when you do that. Like, I'm going to come out the other side of this, right?
So it's
Okay.
okay.
Right, exactly. Like, we're all going to be good here. That having that kind of faith in your body and in the process is a huge deep dive that takes a specific kind of letting go. And I think that there's a darkness there that we all face in that moment, and that I see all women face whether or not they have an epidural. And I think that most women in our culture can't point to it, name it, and talk about it because it's, first of all, not acceptable to fully feel that way about your birth, and that we don't have the words to describe it because it's a little bit scary to think about it in that context. And so it's roses and yay, and it went well, and we're all alive. But no one's like, and that was like fucked up. You know what I mean? Yeah, but people tell people like me that. Do people tell people like you that? Psychologists?
It depends. I mean, the question of was it a fucked up birth, I think is very subjective. And I think one thing that comes up related to trauma, birth trauma, is questioning if your trauma is valid. So you may have an experience where your life really was in danger, or your baby's life was in danger, or your plan didn't go as expected, and you had a medical intervention that was terrifying. And for others, maybe none of those events happened, but you left on the other side of the experience feeling like you were changed and something doesn't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you call that a trauma? That's where I think it becomes a very subjective experience in how you are suffering, or how you experience and interpreted the event after it happened. For example, I can think of, stories of women who, and maybe I'm jumping ahead too much, but after going through giving birth, everything was back to normal. Objectively, everything looks fine, baby's healthy, and they're still not feeling okay. And maybe they're focusing on an aspect of the experience that was traumatic. You mentioned no one held your hand.
Mm-hmm.
I hear women express moments like this that are traumatic moments because they felt that they didn't get the support that they needed in that moment. For another person, maybe objectively, they had a medical intervention, so that's trauma. For someone else, they felt uncared for, and so it's not a visible trauma. So there's so many different experiences and the birth experience that could be perceived as traumatic, as having overwhelmed you, as having felt outside of your control.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, from my position as a therapist is really to work with wherever someone is subjectively, what their experience was. Because a traumatic experience may not be a trauma for you, but it is for the woman who's gone through it.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. And also I wonder if the thing that you're hanging your hat on as traumatic may just be the first thing you're thinking of, but underneath it is another layer of what that really means. Like the holding your hand isn't just about the holding your hand, but it's the whole experience of like, I thought I was having a vaginal birth and suddenly it's an emergency C-section,
Right.
and then the recovery afterwards being even more traumatic than that, being unsupported through that, and then
Right.
having depression or being anxious, and it could bring up all kinds of things, but it just started with someone not holding your hand. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right. And certainly it opens the door for a lot of wounds from other parts of your experience.
You
and
had said
history.
that people bring to their trauma a lot of their childhood, to their birth
To
trauma.
their birth story.
To the birth story, the childhood experiences, and I was interested in.
Yeah, well, just in terms of, because I know the event is birth stories.
Yes.
And so, everyone has a story that leads to the moment of birth that's been formulating. And sometimes it's in awareness, from childhood you always wanted to be a mom. And for others, it's not in awareness, it's more the models you had around you, the expectations of care. And so you bring those stories, they're kind of embedded in your experience, to that moment. And so when it's actually time to give birth, sometimes those stories become unearthed. So whether you felt like you were cared for during the birth experience, whether you felt the hospital staff was attentive enough, no one held, I'm sorry to use your example, but just a hand holding. So sometimes your story starts to emerge in the context of the birth experience, and in particular, a traumatic birth experience.
And research shows that satisfaction in birth has nothing to do with your physical experience, so the material way that the birth manifested. It has to do with the agency that you felt you had throughout the labor. So in that way, it really is a completely subjective experience where you are on that spectrum.
Such an interesting fact when I learned
Isn't
that.
it?
Yeah.
Another thing that I've heard a therapist say that I just love is that you have to keep your grief warm. And I thought that was so interesting. So you had this question about, like, is it better to know or to not know? And how do I know if I did or I didn't have an experience that was an aberration, experience that was like really bad, and going back to the idea that talking about it and processing it is going to be better ultimately. The idea that to take an experience and to shove it down and put it away and try to just put it in the box and let it kind of like let the grief die. The grief over the experience you thought you were going to have, over your partner not supporting you enough, over whatever the elements are. That in fact that's where it starts to fester. Whereas if you keep it close and it becomes part of the story that you tell in a way where you feel like, yeah, this is the story. There's someone had said, I hate that this is part of the story of this day, right? That's supposed to be momentous.
I associate something I hate with the birth of my daughter.
And so instead to keep the grief somewhere where you have kind of like a handle on it and you understand it and it's part of your story in a way that you feel comfortable with is actually going to be the healthier, happier place ultimately. I just think that's such an elevated concept, right?
I want to talk a little bit about science and medicine and read a quote from one of the Not Safe for Mom group members. Now I look back and know that although traumatic, it's made me stronger and an even better mom because I know the fragility that is life and never take my little one for granted, because who knows what might have been if science wasn't as advanced. I got a lot of quotes from moms about, well, without medical advances, without science, my baby wouldn't be here today. And that is true for many people, but I also felt like within that statement, we're kind of writing off our grief or our feelings of disappointment or sadness. And it's like that person, your friend who you're telling your birth story to, and they're like, at least you have a healthy baby. And then you're like, not allowed to have a feeling. And I just wanted to talk about that kind of approach in two ways. I want to talk about that at least you have a healthy baby feeling, and how maybe you approach that with your patients, and then I also want to talk about the thank God for science part of it.
Mm-hmm. Let's start with Ingrid's.
I think that quote is an example of how we try to make meaning out of experience. This was a difficult experience, and to find a way to kind of neatly package it and to hopefully to move on from it. But I think what happens often is that some of the difficult feelings that come up after going through a traumatic experience then don't get acknowledged. And I think one of the goals that I would have in therapy is to be able to hold those two positions and to be able to acknowledge that yes, you have a healthy baby, but yes, that was a really difficult and overwhelming experience, and that you're able to hold those two positions. That would be one target. So it's not just the healthy baby side, such that you don't acknowledge the difficult feelings that went along with that, because when you don't, what often happens is that those feelings tend to present themselves when you least expect it. That's when you start to have symptoms, like some of the ones I was describing initially. So it's kind of blocking out one part of the whole experience. And I think the goal in the therapy I do anyway is to try to not have the fragmented experience, but to have a whole experience where you're able to kind of sit with those two positions and still have some peace and acceptance with both.
To make it more specific, the question is kind of like, just tell me what you think. I don't want to vilify the medical profession. My dad is a physician, he's a fertility specialist. We had a very heated conversation last night. But I've learned so many new things about medicine. We have so many C-sections happening in New York City. Does everybody need one? I wanted to understand a little bit more about the systems that you do talk about and have. I know you could do like a whole book on it, but
we can break it down.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it even ties back to the question of how do I know if I had a messed up birth. And so the C-section rates right now are so high, and statistically speaking, it's really not possible that every single one of those C-sections was necessary. With that said, it doesn't mean that we actually could have avoided the C-sections we had, because we are not in actual full control over the birth that we're having, and nor really are our bodies, because we birth in a very specific context, which is not just in America, but in New York City. And so whether you're in Manhattan or the surrounding boroughs, New York State has 3 freestanding birth centers, and Texas has over 70, and California has over 40. So those are birth centers that are outside of a hospital altogether. And I only cite that to illustrate that there are very few options as just a rule. You're not gonna have all the options that you might somewhere else. And then, we have to look at how the medical system evolves and how, I can say it again, Siri. A lot of words again. But if you think about how medical practitioners especially obstetric practitioners and gynecologists, do not go into the medical field for money. There's very little money in that. They do not go into the medical field to hurt people or to make crazy decisions or to be constantly stressed. But the way that our medical system educates and the way that Western medicine has been so successful in its brilliance is that it's very specific. And by specializing, what happens in women's health generally, but especially in matrescence, so the process of becoming pregnant, giving birth, and then postpartum and being now in this new phase of your life because your whole body's changed, your brain's changed, your endocrinology's changed, that's not going away. You're forever postpartum. That is not really a multi-practitioner arc, but that's how Western medicine has divvied it up. So you go and you have, and help curb me if I'm going into a different direction you want me to, but you have, you're pregnant, you see your obstetrician, you give birth maybe with your obstetrician, maybe with someone else, with some nurses who specialize in this moment, but they have lots of patients. And then you give birth, and then you see your obstetrician once, and then you're done. And then you have an umbilical hernia or something, and then you see a general surgeon, and then you have a prolapse, so then you go back to a different obstetrician, gynecologist, and then then what do you do after that? So no one's actually tracing the arc, and then you finally find your way, hopefully, to a physical therapist who specializes in pelvic floor, but probably doesn't take insurance, so somehow you get yourself there. And then they're like, well, I've seen all of this, and this is why this all happened, and you're like, wow, how come no one told me? And it's not that each one of those doctors didn't know. It's that they actually didn't know. It's not that they were choosing to do something without knowledge. It's that they're looking, I know how to fix your umbilical hernia. I have no idea what the alternatives are to that, and it's actually very unfair of us in a lot of ways to expect that individual to know how to rub your back when you're in labor, when that is not what they're trained to do, So I think it's really important to not vilify medicine, because I don't think that it behooves anybody, and I feel really bad right now for the way that the medical providers are experiencing their profession, especially in obstetrics. And I think it is incumbent upon us as individuals to educate each other and educate ourselves, and to take these lessons back home and tell our friends, there are other ways and other practitioners, but that's very difficult to do because how much responsibility can you really take, and how do you know, and really pushing back against a doctor is hard, and it's fraught. And so it's on one hand, you, I guess, could have had another birth experience, but you would have really had to change everything.
The whole system.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because a nurse who has 8 other patients can't be your doula. They just physically can't.
You want them to be doting and warm.
Right.
And the lack of that can also be traumatic.
Right.
They were so dismissive of me.
Right. And so I think it's important when we look back and we think well, did I have a messed up birth? Yes, and no, but more yes than no. But to again put it all in context, because until you understand what happened, it just feels like this big black hole that, especially because your memory of it will be a little bit foggy in some ways, and some things will be salient to others. Just to remember that there were caring people there who were doing the best that they could, but it is a broken system right now.
And I think one point that we really need to drive home is that it's not your fault.
It is not at all.
Because a lot of the messages that I got were, well, maybe if I had done this differently, a different outcome could have happened. Maybe if I'd had a doula, something else would have happened, or if I'd had a home birth, this would have happened, or if I was in the hospital from the beginning, this other thing would have happened. And so I had that camp of women writing to me. And then the other camp was what's the point of having a birth plan if birth is all out of our control anyway?
So the birth plan conversation, just really quickly on that, I think a birth plan is super, super important, because the primary thing the birth plan does is signal to the hospital staff, to the team, that you have done research and that you're interested in agency, that you're interested in a conversation. And once they understand that, they are much more likely to involve you. And I know that no one wants to piss anyone off, but if you bring it with some Trader Joe's treats, like they kind of cancel each other out and you're good. But you know, that is what that birth plan does. That does not mean that it's going to fully be followed. It's not even mean that it's possible. But in an ideal situation, the same medical staff that's there. And listen, you can also just get a nurse or a doctor whose kid was up all night throwing up and they're really tired and they're going through their own shit. They're getting divorced. They're, you know what I mean? Like, and these are just, we're just all people doing work ultimately. But a birth plan does just say, I have some ideas and I've done a little bit of research and I have some preferences and I'm open to conversation about that. As opposed to coming in and being like, you're boss, whatever you say goes. Because that's also a really difficult power differential that is hard, that I have some friends who are doctors, it's very hard for them when they get that because now they feel like that's actually the kind of patient who will end up being more likely to sue. Because they've fully given, like, you're making the decision for me, as opposed to a patient who's like, let's have it back and forth, and then psychologically there is a shared decision being made. And so that worries them, which I think is super counterintuitive.
Having a birth plan
Yes.
worries them.
No. That when a patient comes in and is like, whatever you say goes,
Oh, okay.
as opposed to being like, because think about how much information there is for a doctor who's coming in to say, here are some risks, and they talk really fast and they have like the sheets and someone's signing them on the way to the ER. Think about how much information, if you've not done any research and you're basically saying that to them, that's just a whole lot more that they have to fight off in educating you, and now they really have to make sure that they're making a decision that is like the lowest risk, which is for them always going to be a C-section, because their risk ends after that 6 weeks basically, which is not when most C-section complications happen.
I want to talk about blissful births. I will leave time for questions, but I want to make sure to talk about this because I think the comparison to other people's births does bring in a lot of feelings. My very good friend just gave birth the other day, and I had prepared her for all the horrible things that could go wrong, and given her all the warning signs of like postpartum depression to start looking out for, like told her partner all about it, and she had this amazing birth experience. No drugs, it was too late for the epidural, and like the whole thing was magical, she said, and her partner, who she like was in a huge fight with a couple months ago, and he's now like the most amazing dad. Like, you know, and just like I'm just getting like these little texts of just how amazing and beautiful and perfect everything is, and I am jealous. And I'm jealous, and I don't have a baby right now. I have an 8-year-old, you know, and a 5-year-old. I'm so far from it. I don't know why I'm comparing my experience to hers. But I can only imagine what it's like when you just had a baby, or your baby's a year old, and you're still really living in your birth story. And then you have a friend who's telling you their birth story, and you're like, it was great. It went all according to plan. It was so beautiful. It was so perfect. And Instagram is a huge culprit in the magical birth story narrative. And I think that I wanted to ask you, like, in your experiences, who are these people who have beautiful births, and how does that happen?
I don't know.
You can testify.
I don't usually
real?
see those people.
I don't see it.
To be honest with you.
Is it real?
Yeah. I mean, maybe Sarah could speak more about that, but I don't usually see the blissful birth experience. If I do, that's usually in the beginning, and then I see them come much later when some of that facade starts to break down a little bit. Not facade, but just maybe the way that they processed in that moment. But maybe Sarah can speak more about that, the blissful birth.
Yeah, I mean, I think the birth envy is very real, and it's understandable because it's like a 1, 2, 3 times in a lifetime experience, and you feel like you got robbed of it, and especially now where those of us who are living in areas where we can access the wild, most of us have this idea of this kind of birth that we can have. And again, sure, theoretically we can, but how, like all the different things we have to set up to do that are frankly just completely out of reach for a lot of people financially, and even in terms of knowledge of how to find those kinds of practitioners and that kind of experience. and then you're still not guaranteed it. And I think, I mean, the best way that I can explain how somebody who came through a blissful birth experience is having that experience, for those of us who haven't had one, is that there's a real triumph to coming through it. And I wish that women who had cesarean births or births that were traumatizing can also transform, like keep your grief warm and transform it into triumph. Like there's something super powerful about waking up after, or not sleeping the night after you had a baby, and then the sun rising again, and waking up and being like, oh, okay, I did that, we did that, somehow that happened, you know? And then waking up again the next day and again, and every day learning more and realizing that, again, we're all having a very challenging experience. What did I survive, basically? What is my triumph? And that maybe, in fact, that is something that can be super, super empowering, because maybe it's something you never thought you could survive, and then it happened and here you are. I think that a lot of women who are having these blissful birth experiences are very much in the fog of that immediate triumph, because you get such a payback immediately after pushing a baby out, which is like what we were all going for, was that like crazy birth high, right? And that maybe we just have a delayed arc on that if we needed some more time to process that. And you know what our triumph is and was. And I think that that birth is like fishing, you know, it's like the fish gets longer every time you tell the story, and the birth gets more blissful every time you tell the story, because you're reading people's reactions and you're figuring out what's getting the most positive feedback, right? Or the most like feedback. So I witnessed that too. Like someone will tell me the birth story one time and then they'll tell it to me a year later, and I'm like, that birth just got 5 hours longer. You know, I remember that's different than last time. Or the opposite, that birth just got so much more magical because nature has helped you shade that beautiful birth in some way. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to open up to questions. And so my plan is questions, last words, and then Ingrid is going to do a little closing exercise for us. So the floor is yours.
I have a question. Why do you suggest using the term cesarean birth instead of C-section?
The term C-section is it suggests that there wasn't a birth, and that you didn't come through something, and that somebody else birthed your child for you, when there's a million ways that you can have a vaginal exit and be assisted in a myriad of ways, but you still get to call it a vaginal birth, right? Again, I want to go back to the core reality that the vast majority of us are going to be recovering, especially from our first births, for 4 to 6 weeks after having a baby. We are gonna, and if you've labored and then had a C-section, now you get the added bonus of getting to recover from both, right? From labor and from C-section. So I think that changing the C-section term to cesarean birth, it means that you now get to own that you did give birth to that baby. You went through the same faith exercise that your body can handle this, and that you can do this, and that your baby's gonna be strong, the same way as somebody who had a physiologic or a vaginal birth. And I think language matters.
I have a question on language. Do you think that the term or that the use of the idea of a birth plan sort of sets us up for failure in many ways? And I've heard recently that a lot of people are sort of throwing out the birth plan altogether, so that so many more scenarios can be contemplated or not contemplated, but can at least be in the realm of possibility rather than.
I think that the term birth plan is misleading. However, I think that birth ideas or something that you're bringing into, I think it is very, very important if you have any ideas that are likely to be outside of what hospital protocol is, which is a great many things, that you have those down on paper somewhere. Again, a doctor is much more likely to go by them, even if there's just like a document that they can cite if they decide to do it. It's going to make them feel so much more comfortable with the risk associated with that in terms of their liability, because obstetrics is now primarily practiced as like a malpractice aversion, scenario, which makes puts everyone on the back foot. But I think that part of what somebody who's sitting down with you to help you make a birth plan, like a doula or birth educator, they're sitting down and they're also using it as a rubric for how to educate you through what you're going to be posed with. Because if you don't do that, then you just get there and there are just so many options. And what it does is it forces you in that moment to opt in or out in your ideal scenario. And you're right, the danger of that is that you then are living this fantasy of this ideal scenario in your head. So I think that can lead to disappointment. I totally see that, but I still do think that there's a value in assessing what you would do in the ideal scenario, and that ideally the person who's guiding you through that exercise is also taking that opportunity to say, but if X, Y, and Z, then it's like you don't choose your own adventure, the adventure chooses you exercise, where you start to learn, and that is ideally what it's fleshing out the dark and the light at the same time.
I'm also a doula, and I agree with everything you're saying, and I don't call it a plan, I call it a framework. I specifically use the term framework because I think people get so caught up on the word plan, and I think it's a great sort of reference for if things are going down a different path. Let's say it looks like that you are going to have to look at an alternative delivery method like a cesarean. We can still go through that really quickly and say, well, XYZ was really important. Skin to skin, immediate skin to skin in the OR. Let's see if we can ask for these things. So it's a great way to get your mind going about what really is the most important. But I think the word plan is tricky.
I agree.
Framework and ideas.
Yeah.
I like those.
Yeah.
So I have a question about how, in birth stories, how to talk about trauma in a way that's empowering. Because it wasn't until, I heard lots of birth stories, but it wasn't until I started talking about my own traumatic experience, which is still pretty raw for me, that I heard others' traumatic experiences. And I want to talk about it because while it's trauma and I'm processing it, I'm also really proud because me and my baby did that. I mean, we ended up where we are through all of that. But I feel like when a lot of other women come to me and they say, like, I too had this element of your experience, it's almost like they still cry, even if it's decades old, because there's not this empowering language to talk about trauma. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, I want to keep talking about it for myself and for other women, but it can be really hard to talk about it in a way that feels like it's forwarding the conversation, that it's empowering me and others in the way that I really want it to.
Are you talking about just in like your personal circles, like sharing with friends, or when you say talking about it, what?
It's
what
mostly friends, like in personal circles, but I've also started feeling really strongly about on social media, if and when I do talk about how my son was born, I want to talk about it the way it happened. I want to mention that he stayed in the hospital. I don't want to shy away from that because it's a really important part of the story. Just mentioning what happened in the first 24 hours isn't the story.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's very individual, and it's kind of working with what your level of comfort is with sharing and the platforms that you put your story out there. How comfortable are you to receive what comes back, especially in a social media context. The work I do is one-to-one usually, so sharing in that context, I'm able to sort of titrate how the story goes to sort of check in. So I think the only concern I would have is just you don't know on the other end how someone is going to receive it or respond to you. So I'm thinking more just in terms of protecting you. But from my experience in working with hearing traumatic stories, it usually starts by having a ground, making sure that the person is grounded, so is able to feel, present and able to tolerate any of the strong feelings that come with that sharing. And also to check in along the way. So that back and forth is really important. I don't know if either of you could speak about what it's like on maybe a social media platform, because that's not an area I have as much experience with, and my concerns would just be how to sort of manage what comes up around that.
I get to manage what people hear in response to their stories. So, if you shared your story and I posted it anonymously and someone wrote back something that, just by my own judgment, not as a therapist, but as a human being, I would feel could be damaging to you, I don't post that. And I just try to make it a supportive and encouraging conversation